We're live.
Hello again, everybody. Welcome to another Geo-Institute live stream. We have a very special event for you today, one that we are very proud to have been able to pull together. It is not just the Geo-Institute today. We are partnered with USUCGER, which in a moment, our moderator will tell you what that stands for. It's a very long acronym. If you don't know anything about the Geo-Institute, after you watch today, you should head over to geoinstitute.org, and there you will find out that we are a technical society with about 12,000 members, most of whom are geotechnical engineers and or geologists, and we are part of the American Society of Civil Engineers. So what we are here to do today is to commemorate one of our Mount Rushmore figures in the profession, as I like to say. Professor Harry Seed spent much of his career, most of his career, at the University of California at Berkeley, and you will hear a lot more about Berkeley in the coming hour. Last Friday, on August 19th, Professor Seed would have turned 100 years old, and so we thought, what better time to talk about his life and legacy than now? And so we also thought, who should we partner up with on this very special day? And we came up with USUCGER, and that's for a few reasons. One, Adda will tell you a little bit more about USUCGER in a minute, but as president of USUCGER, she is also at the University of California at Berkeley. So there were many great happenstances here, and everything came together, and we are very happy to be presenting you with this panel today. And so I will not say any more flowery words. I will turn it right over to Adda Athanasopoulos-Zekkos, who's going to do the introductions of our panel and moderate it today, which is the final thing I'll say. If and when you have any questions for our group, please put them in the chat box over to the right of the video that you are watching. You can even like and subscribe and get notifications if you are so inclined, and we will let you know every time we post something to the YouTube channel. Now with that, here's Adda.
Thank you so much, Brad, and thanks to the Geo-Institute for partnering with us for this really truly special event. So before I introduce the speakers today, as Brad mentioned, I am the president of USUCGER, which stands for United States Universities Council on Geotechnical Education and Research. We have a newly refurbished website at usugar.org, so please go check it out. And if you're an academic and you are going to become a member, please watch out for the email we send for getting your dues to us as soon as possible. So as Brad mentioned, I am also a faculty at the University of California at Berkeley, part of the Geosystems group. And even though, unfortunately, I didn't have the pleasure and honor of meeting Professor Harry Seed in person, my PhD advisor was Ray Seed. And so I can say that I have heard a few stories, but I think that we're going to hear several more today. We have four great guests with us who have all interacted with Professor Harry Seed at some point in their careers, and they are ready to tell us all about it. Before I start, I will again remind of what Brad said, because we do want to make this interactive. Please feel free to post your questions as you're watching this, while you're hearing some kind of story. If something piques your interest and you want to know more or add some detail, please feel free to do so, and I will bring your question to our speakers. I will introduce all four of them, and then we will start with Professor Ray Seed. So Professor Ray Seed, who joins us today, is a professor emeritus from the University of California at Berkeley. We also have Dr. Faiz Makdisi with us, who is a senior consultant at Gannet Fleming. We have Dr. Lelio Mejia, a senior principal at Geosyntec. And we have Dr. Les Harder, a senior water resources technical advisor at HDR. And it was per their request that I am keeping these introductions very, very short, as I'm sure you all recognize that there is much more that I could say for all four of them. So without further ado, I will give the mic first to Professor Ray Seed to get us going.
Thank you, Adda. My assignment is to tell a short story, which is more or less how Harry Seed became the Harry Seed that we all came to know. And it's not the story that people expect, so it's kind of interesting. Harry Seed was born in a part of England called Lancashire. Lancashire is the northwest corner of England up against the Scottish border, and it is exactly the wrong place to be born. If you're born in Lancashire, you are the lowest of the lowest classes. You have a big, thick accent that you can never lose, and you don't have any H's. There's no H's in Lancashire. So he was hobbled by a name Harry, which was never pronounced properly for the first half of his life, because of course in Lancashire it was Harry. That really upset him. Harry wanted to be a gentleman, and he figured that the way to do that was to be successful and rise above his humble beginnings. And so he set to work to accomplish that. He began in school. Lancashire is a big county. We're a little over 1 million people there. And although they're the poor people at the bottom end of the totem pole, there is a fellowship every year from Lancashire to King's College at London University. And so Harry set himself to getting the fellowship. To get the fellowship, he had to be the valedictorian of the high school class at the magnet school to which all the best students were progressively sent. And to do that, he had to get A's in all of his classes, including Latin. Only 6 students took Latin. The Latin instructor was a sadist. Nobody liked him, and nobody wanted to be in his class. He had 6 seats. There were 3 in the front row and 3 in the next row. The front left seat would be the A at the end of the year. The next seat would get a B. The one on the right would get a C, and so would the top left. Then there'd be a D, and the guy in the back corner would get an F. And the instructor would come to class every day, and for an hour they would all talk Latin, and every now and then he would shift to students, and your grade had just changed. Harry had to be in the bottom left corner to get to King's College University. So he did all the rest of his homework and then would study Latin all night, which he hated. And he won the lottery and finished in the front left corner, and he got to King's College, at which point he figured he had succeeded. He was at a top university, and therefore he was a gentleman. He was rapidly disabused of that notion because they told him it doesn't count if you're from Lancashire. And that pissed him off and upset him greatly, but it was okay because a guy named Adolf Hitler started World War II, and all of a sudden school was canceled. And if you were at a good university, you were a second lieutenant in the British Army. And as some of you will know, if you're an officer in the British Army, you were an officer and a gentleman, and that was the goal. The other officers quickly explained to him it doesn't count if you're from Lancashire, and that pissed him off again. So he fought the war and had actually some good times doing it because he was actually extraordinarily valuable in his regiment. He was really popular. He was an extremely good soccer player because if he hadn't made it to college on academics, he was going to try and get there on a soccer scholarship. And when 2 English regiments park near each other for any reason, instantly a soccer game is challenged. And he was really good at scoring goals. He was a striker, and he would go through the middle and score goals. And the colonel let it be known that if Harry Seed got killed in the war, people would pay for it. He wanted Harry Seed scoring goals. After the war was over, he returned to King's College, finished 4 years of undergraduate studies in civil engineering, and went home for the summer to study for final exams, because back then you took all your exams at the end of the summer after your senior year. It's kind of a high stakes thing. He got off the train at home in his little town of Bolton, which is also his middle name. They didn't name it after him. It was the other way around, I think. And they had lost his luggage. 4 years of textbooks and class notes were gone. So we spent the summer traveling and staying with classmates, using their notes and their books to study, took the exams at the end of the summer, and did rather well. He actually scored the highest marks ever at King's College in civil engineering up to that point in time, and progressed on to the graduate program, at which point he figured he had it made. He was probably now on his way to being a gentleman. He was assigned a PhD research project. There were some glamorous ones. He had high marks. He figured he'd have his pick, but he got the last choice. And the last choice was a long dissertation research project on creep of structural concrete. And what he learned was never do research on anything that has the word creep in it, because creep happens slowly. And so do PhDs on creep. So he saw that through and got his PhD. And didn't enjoy it much at all. And looked around. He'd done some looking. He didn't want to be a structural engineer. There were a couple of guys named Terzaghi and Casagrande that were starting this new thing called geotechnical engineering or something like that at Harvard University. and it seemed very exciting. So they offered him a position at King's College as a professor, which would have made him an officer and a gentleman, more or less, but he turned it down, taking a chance here because it was a chance to be a gentleman, and he applied instead to Harvard University. He applied for a scholarship that was somewhat obscure, and Harvard responded, "We don't know how to give it to you. No one's ever applied for that before." So they made him a lecturer, at which point he was nominally a professor, and that was good. And he worked for 2 years with Casagrande and Terzaghi and pretty much buckled down to learn soil mechanics. When he finished, he was informed that he and another student, Professor Ron Scott, would be sent to the West Coast to bring fire to the wilderness. Terzaghi and Casagrande at that point were sending doctoral students out to start geotechnical programs, and Ron Scott was well-born. He'd been to all the best schools and all the academies. He had the right accents, and he was going to go to Berkeley. Harry Seed, the poor kid from Lancashire, was going to go to Caltech, which is at that point a fairly elite place to be. So Harry went down the hall and had a talk with Dr. Terzaghi and said, "I don't think I really deserve to go to Caltech. Ron Scott's got the right accent. He's an elegant fellow. It's an elegant academy. He'll fit in perfectly right there. I think I should just go to Cal and see if I can make the best of it." And so a switch was made. And that got Harry Seed to Berkeley. That wasn't quite really the reason he wanted to go to Cal. And the reason he wanted to go to Cal actually is interesting and hasn't been talked about much because there was a small violation of some laws involved. He hadn't just had the best grades at King's College. He'd also, in his graduating senior year, been the captain of the all-English soccer team because he was really good at scoring goals. By the time the war was over, he had a lot of practice. And that's like being captain of the all-American team graduating from college. Except that back then you didn't get millions and millions of dollars. You got about 200-300 pounds a game. And you had to drink some of that with the guys afterwards in the bar. And it wasn't something you could build a career out of and make a future out of. So his timing was poor there. So he was very, very good at soccer. And he wanted to go to Cal. And nobody could really quite figure that because Cal was a place with some opportunity and it was growing. But he was really set on going to Cal. And what you should know about that is he wanted to go to Cal because of soccer. A bunch of European immigrants had buckled down over the previous roughly 15 to 20 years and were trying very hard to introduce proper soccer to the United States. This was a national effort. It was taking root in places like St. Louis, Chicago area, New York, and one of the places was the San Francisco Bay Area. And the hub of that effort was the Olympic Club on the San Francisco Peninsula. It's a very elite club. The people who belong to the club have more money than people probably need. And they were spending some of it financing the highest paid amateur soccer team in North America. And no, I didn't misspeak that. They were an amateur team and they were highly paid, especially their striker, a guy named Harry Seed, who could squirt through the middle and score goals. So Harry Seed was highly motivated. He'd fought a war. He'd gone to graduate school twice. He'd gone to college and he was getting a late start on life and he wanted to start a family, buy a house, all those kinds of things. And so the money was important to him. Assistant professors do not get paid very much money. Associate professors get a living wage and full professors do just fine, thank you. But you couldn't get married and start a family on an assistant professor salary, but you could on an assistant professor salary if you were making more money than that, scoring goals for the Olympic Club soccer team. And so Harry Seed was an amazing story in lots of ways, but it was essentially a series of odd coincidences, strange opportunities, and a resolute determination to make the most of each chance and opportunity that came along that more or less created the Harry Seed that in the end we all came to know and love. When he arrived at Cal and outgrew scoring goals because he became too old and became actually a tenured full professor and could afford himself, he didn't slow down. And right to the end of his career, he was still going 100 miles a minute. He set himself to working 65 hours a week and producing 10 publishable pages every week. That was his goal. And he only failed that in the last few months of his life as he was dying of cancer. It was an incredible performance, born of initial hardship and the anger that it brewed within him, and replaced in the end by joy. He had nothing but joy for 40 years. He'd found his thing. Geotechnical engineering was it. He loved the work, he loved the people, and he had a wonderful life. So that's how Harry Seed became Harry Seed. Thanks.
Thank you, Ray, for that. It is quite a story to really get into the details of how someone, the happenstance and everything that kind of crosses your path that makes it what we all now know, of course, and is going to be part of geotechnical history, I think, forever. Before we kind of let you go, meaning your turn go, of course, to kind of switch over to Dr. Faiz Makdisi, I'm kind of curious, since you also saw both the personal and the professional sides of Professor Harry Seed. What would you say was one of the best pieces of advice that he gave you as a father, but also as a professor and as a fellow geotechnical engineer?
He was very big on the notion of making the most of every opportunity. He was one of those guys that believed you should show up early. You should have already done the project if possible. So you're doing it a second time as the teacher is explaining it to you. You should read ahead, all those kinds of things. He was always making the most of every possible moment. And it made for a wonderful career. It did wonderful things for the profession, but it was hard. It came with a price. And he died young. He died at the age of 66 and a half. It would have been nice to have had him a little longer, but he, to some extent, sort of almost worked himself to death. He just never, ever slowed down. So I would say it was a bit of a mixed bag, and you could learn a lot from his work ethic and his dedication. But my advice would be, and it's nice to also have a life, and a family, and other things as well, and you have to do some balancing. I wouldn't recommend that as a career trajectory for anybody but those most maniacally dedicated.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for sharing that wonderful story. We'll move over to Dr. Faiz Makdisi. Of course, I'm sure everybody knows him. If you have not referenced Makdisi and Seed at some point in your life as a geotechnical engineer, I'm not sure you should be allowed to practice. I'm joking, but of course he has had the pleasure, of course, of working with Professor Harry Seed. So I'm sure he also has some stories to share with us. So thank you so much for joining us today, Faiz.
Thank you, Adda. And I had the privilege of associating with Professor Seed, which I called him Professor all the time, even after I graduated. He used to say, "Call me Harry," and I never would. I come from a culture where we respect our teachers immensely. What I'm going to acknowledge that the entire community and the professional community and the geotechnical engineering community worldwide acknowledges the contributions and the professional contributions of Harry Seed. What I'm going to touch on with a couple of anecdotes of my experience with him is on the humanity of Harry Seed. Harry Seed had a passion and a compassion and an empathy and kindness and generosity. He was my advisor at the MS degree, and when I finished, I was looking for getting enlarging or extending my visa before going back home for practical training for 18 months. They provide you a work visa. So I applied for a couple of companies there, and he was always concerned about what's your plan, what are you thinking of doing? I said, I'd like to get 18 months of practical training. I got an offer from Dames and Moore at the time to work with them, but they put a condition. They said, you have to apply for permanent residency because we don't want to train you and maybe we want to hire you for long. So I thought of doing that, and some of my students, American students and friends said, this is the 71 at the height of the Vietnam War. Go check out your lottery number and your birth date and see if you're going to be drafted if you get permanent residency. I checked that one out, and I found out if I do that, I will end up in Vietnam. I didn't come from Lebanon all the way half across the earth to get an education and go back home and then go back to Vietnam and fight in the war. So I declined, and it was a tight market at the time. And Professor Seed came back and said, "Well, what have you done?" I said, "Well, I don't have any options." He said, "Do you really want to get practical training?" I said, "Yes, I would love to." He said, "Are you willing to work for free?" I said, "Well, I'd like to work, but maybe with covering my life expenses, expenses and so on, I would do that." He said, "Well, okay, come next Monday, and you have a job as a junior specialist to work with a project that we're just about to start, evaluating the performance of the two San Fernando dams during the San Fernando earthquake. And you will join Dr. Ed Idris and Ken Lee in this project for 2 years." So he gave me a junior specialist position. Didn't pay much, but it covered my expenses. And I spent 2 years working full time on this project. And after finishing that, he said, if you're interested, we have a research assistantship to go for a PhD. So I did that. And these 2 years as full time working with him and going through a PhD degree and being mentored by him have affected my trajectory of my entire career for the 40 years since then. So that's the generosity and kindness. Here's another anecdote of his fairness and his appreciation of somebody else's point of view. I hope I can do these things in due time. He was off for a week's vacation. Ray, I think sometimes your dad takes off at times. And I think he went for a couple of days of a consulting assignment. And in the meantime, I was exploring, the Berkeley, scene. So I started growing a beard. He came back for a meeting and to check on my work, and he looked at me and said, "Oh, you're growing a beard." I said, "Well, yes, I'm just trying to see how it looks like." He said, "Well, I don't think you should have it. Why don't you go shave it?" So I was kind of taken aback from the look on his face. And I see the look on Ray Seed now. He's my mentor. He was my father figure. I respected his opinion and so on. So I didn't say much. I finished the meeting and went back. It was a Thursday. Spent the 3 or 4 days up to the weekend thinking about it. What, should I shave my beard or should I just stick to, this is my personal decision and so on. I kept it and I said I'll decide on it during the next meeting, which was on a Monday. I came on Monday morning just knowing what to expect and knowing what to expect. And he said, Faiz, last week I told you just go save your beard. It's not appropriate for me to ask you of that. It's your own decision. So decide the way you want, and I'm happy with that. And that tells me how, he's fair. He appreciates, a different point of opinion. He didn't like what I chose, but he said, that's your decision. I think I have maybe a couple of more minutes for another anecdote. And the third one is his humility. We were working on this jigsaw puzzle of putting back the sequence of the failure of the upstream dam of San Fernando Dam, upstream slope of San Fernando Dam, and looking at the liquefied zones and after the trenches and all the field investigations and so on. It was kind of an interesting exercise and a difficult exercise putting things together. We finished everything. And we put we asked the drafter person to finalize the figures and put text on them and so on. And we put the draft review paper that was going to go for ASCE peer review. And then I noticed by looking at these figures that a couple of the text had some typos in it. And I rushed to Professor Seed. I said, "Oh, maybe we goofed here. We still have some typos in there in the text and so on." And the drafting people have already put the package and trying to send them to the reviewer. They said, "Well, these are not very important mistakes. We are all human. We make mistakes. Don't worry about it. Leave it up to the ASCE reviewer to find them and correct them. And don't sweat the small stuff." These are my 3 encounters with Professor Seed, and I value his contribution.
Thank you, Faiz. Really excellent stories. I was actually going to ask, if you could share what was the process, the experience like writing a publication with Professor Harry Seed, as an advisor, how he approached that, how much freedom, the graduate student had, how did that first manuscript come back? Was it all with red pen, or what was the process?
To be fair, he was the main author of the paper that went to the San Fernando NAM's evaluations, but he reviewed 5 or 6 chapters of my thesis. And he is an excellent reviewer. He points things out. He doesn't press you down. He provides the important feedback of what needs to be addressed, what to concentrate on, and what to, create arguments and support these arguments. And as you can tell from his publications, he is a tremendous author.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for sharing all these wonderful stories. We'll go now next to Dr. Lelio Mejia and hear from him some stories, experiences, and anything you'd like to share, Lelio. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Adda, and thank you to the Geo-Institute for inviting me. It's actually a real pleasure to be here. I didn't realize that it had been 100 years since Harry had been born, although I was cognizant of his birthday when I was at Berkeley, and certainly afterwards. It just didn't dawn on me. So when I heard from Brad, about this invitation, I was really excited because it's actually the period that basically formed the rest of my life, and so I really owe a lot to, of course, Berkeley itself and Harry Seed in particular, and we all know that he was a great a giant of our profession, but from a personal point of view, he was just a great mentor to me, and not only a great teacher, I learned so much from him, but also a great mentor, like Faiz. I remember him as a really kind person and generous person. I never saw him upset, or much less angry, actually, at anybody. And of course, he never got upset at me for making mistakes, in the work that I did and so on. And in fact, quite often I did see him in public meetings where somebody would question a position that he had, and he always had the great character of addressing the person in always in a calm way and actually explaining the facts. He didn't, shy away from telling someone that they were wrong about something, but he just did it very calmly in a matter-of-fact way and letting the facts speak for themselves. He also was a great lecturer, and he had 2 styles of teaching. In his earth dams class, which was one of my favorite classes, he would use the conventional methods. He would use the blackboard, and we all had a chance to catch up with him and take notes and gave homework assignments. In his earthquake engineering lecture, it was different. He very seldom went to the blackboard, and most of the time used slides. And so we were all in the old 471 classroom in the dark, basically trying to keep up with him in his lecture, because he was a very eloquent and smooth lecturer, and taking notes in the dark. Some of the smarter students, not me, but others, had clever devices with little lights and so on shining on their notes. I actually was trying to take notes in the dark. But made us work pretty hard. He always, in addition to that, had very interesting sayings, and that he would tell his students, and many of them, I wrote a number of them, but probably my favorite one that was something that sounds a bit off, but it actually resonates quite well for us as a profession, and that is, the good engineer works for the rich client, and so what we can interpret from that is that we, as engineers, shouldn't be selling our services short, that we should actually work for clients, not that they will pay us a lot of money necessarily, but actually that allow us to do a good job, to always do good work as opposed to having to cut corners and cut short. And so that's pretty important. And even if you start, working with a client that in the end doesn't do that, you always need to go the extra mile and always do the best you can on every assignment we have. One of the great things he did is he, of course, consulted on projects worldwide. He was very well known for his methods and procedures at the time, and clients all over the world hired him to help them with seismic stability issues, liquefaction issues, and so on, and always gave his students consulting assignments. And so, at the time, I might not have realized how lucky I was to do that. Of course, I was lucky in all respects in being able to go to Berkeley, but in having Harry as a teacher and as an advisor, but also in the consulting assignments that he gave me. And as a result, I had a chance to work on some outstanding projects, like, for example, Tarbella Dam. And that's maybe still the largest earth embankment dam in the world. And I didn't realize the significance of that at that time. Now that I've been working on dams for many years, I realized, oh wow, that was just a tremendous opportunity. And so he, like that, gave me a number of other opportunities to work on other projects. In addition to that, he paid his students a pretty good wage.
There should be an
for a
option that
student.
says
At that time, a
rename,
consulting
and that's
wage,
where
the
you
kind
can
of wage
put
that
your full name
probably a senior
and
staff engineer would be making,
whatever other
comparable,
signifier
but
you'd
for
like
a
to
student,
add. So for me, I
that
also
was a
put
lot
an
of money,
ASCE.
actually. So it was terrific.
Okay, everyone should be able to
have
join
that.
to start
And,
their video now.
It's interesting. I remember an opportunity working
That's
with
affirmative. Thanks, Amber.
Perfect. You're
Bill
welcome.
Marcuson. He was Harry was a consultant
Okay.
to the U.S. Army Corps
And
of
then I'm
Engineers
going to
on
go ahead,
a
Lizzie,
number
and
of
hit
their
record
dams.
just so you don't have to
And
worry
one of
about
those
that.
was
And
the
then,
Sardis
as
Dam in
always, I'll
Mississippi.
go back
And
through and edit that
this
out.
is at a time when
Perfect.
he had just worked out a number of his
Right.
simplified
Hi, Lizzie, can you
procedures
hear
together
me?
with
I can hear you, yes,
Professor
and you should be
Idris
able to start your
on
video
how
now.
to estimate
can?
the cyclic resistance
Okay, I
of
see
your
soils
voice now.
using
Can other people
I-
hear me?
index
Yeah, we can
testing,
hear you.
standard
How-
penetration
I need
testing.
to switch to my.
And we were in a
it's
meeting
coming over my computer.
with Bill
It's like I have no
Marcuson and Wayne
control over it.
Miganowski,
How do I switch? How do
working
I
through this
control
problem on Sardis
it's going
Dam.
to come through my
And,
headset.
Oh, if you look
and
on the
Harry,
bottom of the Zoom toolbar, you
had
should see the little
had
unmute your
asked
microphone where that
Wayne
is.
to
And if you
draft
click
some
Oh,
up
there it is.
there,
cross-sections
Okay,
of the
I
dam
got it.
showing the
Got it.
layers in the
There we go.
foundation and
Okay,
so
I
on.
got it.
And they had outlined the blow counts and so on. And so he proceeded to, very elegantly work through, okay, this is about
right. And I just sent a
blow
message
count
in
we
the
see
chat
here
for
in
Diane, Lizzie. Hopefully
in
she
this
sees
layer.
that.
And then he said,
She's
well,
going to
okay,
need
and
to
we
change
to
her,
get the cyclic resistance, we're
her
going to add to that
speakers.
blow count 7.5.
Okay.
And so, and no one had heard about this before.
So I have it set
perhaps
where
except
host
for
and
Ed Idris
panelists
and
can
others
share, so that's not
but us
a
in
problem.
the meeting didn't know about this. And so
I also made it where
particularly Bill
the attendees
was quite
cannot chat with
puzzled by that. And
anybody.
he goes, what?
Okay.
And they can't raise their
Why
hands.
would you
So
add
just like all the other
7.5
ones,
to the
they can
blow
only ask
count?
questions through
So
the
he said,
Q&A.
well, because we are dealing here with silty sands.
I think
and
that's
the
it. The only
data
thing that you'll have
that
to
we
make
have
sure,
shows that,
Lizzie, unless
in order
Rob
to,
jumps on,
obtain the right
is the view
cyclic
that people are
resistance
going
for
to
these
see.
types of soils
Okay.
based
Yeah,
on
just
these
spotlighting
correlations,
folks.
you actually
Correct.
have to
And
add
then
7.5
when you
to
click
the,
on the little
to the
view at
blow
the
count.
top, that's where you'll
And
see
so,
like my view or attendee
for
view.
me, it was
Here, I'll make
actually
you
a
co-host
learning
real quick so you can
experience
see that.
watching him
And you have the option of having them like
outline this
completely follow your
very
view
complex
or
problem
follow
and
the
simplify
speaker
where it was
view.
possible to simplify
So it's
without
whatever you
oversimplifying
want to do. I
and
think I
carefully
usually
taking
have
care
it where
of
it's on speaker view
the details that
because
had to be
once you start
worked
spotlighting
out.
people in gallery,
Another
it will
fond memory
like
that
kind
I
of
have
default to
is
that.
actually
So
when I in
But so it's
addition
whatever
to
you're
working
comfortable
with
with,
him
but then you're
on
pretty
some of
much
these
good.
projects and helping him with
If something comes up, just send me a
analysis
message
was
on
with a very
Teams, and
simple
I
task.
can
He would
join real quick and
have
try to help you
consulting
troubleshoot
assignments
something
not
if you
only
need it. Okay.
worldwide but
Great.
also locally.
Okay,
And one
that sounds
time,
All right.
good.
Cool. So I'm going to make you the host,
he
and then
wasn't
yeah,
able
like I said, just
to.
shoot me a
He had
message if
to
anything comes up, and
complete a
I'll pop
report
back
with
on.
a deadline
Great. Okay,
All
that
that
right.
sounds good.
required him to
Okay. All right.
drive
Talk
to
to you
San
soon. Bye.
Thanks,
Francisco
Amber.
and deliver the report.
One other thing,
And this
Diane,
was
I'm
in
going to
an
make
area
you a
of
co-host, or
downtown San
actually,
Francisco in
Lizzie,
the
make
financial
Diane a
district,
co-host,
Okay.
where there's
just in
no
case for some
parking
reason
at
you
any
get
time
kicked
of the
out of
day,
the meeting.
basically.
The whole
And
thing
so
won't end.
Harry
It's always good to
asked
have a
me if I
backup
would
co-host, just in
come with
case.
him.
I've never
And my job was
actually had it
while
happen,
he
Rob, and I
went
tested it
around the
once
block
just to see if that's what
a
happened.
couple of
But I've
times
never actually had
for
it
me to
happen
go
during a meeting.
inside the
But
building
yes, please
and
make
hand
Diane a
deliver this
co-host
report
as your
to
backup.
his client.
Hey,
And
Fred,
so,
I was just,
of course,
going to ask if I need
said,
to be
yes,
here. Often I
I'd
go
love
sit
to
in the
do that
audience to
and,
kind of
get a
see
chance to
their
interact with
perspective.
him
But yes, I
while we
will be
were
here
driving to San
as
Francisco and,
needed.
talk
Great.
about his,
All right. Good luck, and I
his
will
car.
talk
I'm
to you guys
sure he
later.
thought that was,
Thanks,
a
Sam.
very simplistic thing. I didn't have a lot of things to ask him, but, what I do remember asking him, what kind of mileage do you get in this car? And he said, well, if you have to ask, you probably can't afford it, or something to that effect, which I thought was, oh, wow. Okay, what a stupid question. In any case, it was a really fun memory. So, I probably didn't realize it at the time as well as I do now, how lucky and how fortunate I was to have Harry Seed as a teacher and as a mentor, and really how it affected the rest of my life. So that's what I want to convey to the audience. Thank you, Adda.
Of course. Thank you, Lelio, very much. It's interesting to hear the parking situation has not changed in San Francisco in 4 decades. So
I think it's gotten worse, if you can believe that.
yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for these stories. Since you were here, and you had him also as an instructor, and you kind of experienced him here at Cal, I was kind of wondering how you felt he approached different, let's say, aspects of geotechnical engineering, meaning field, and field investigation and field testing versus lab testing, lab work, and numerical analysis, to the extent, of course, that it was being conducted, especially earlier on in his career. But is that something that he would talk about, not necessarily take a position for or against, but what would you say his thoughts were around that?
That's a great question. It's interesting, and I do remember him telling me once, and maybe others, that he in his research work had evolved quite a bit. In the early days, he was doing a lot of research on material behavior and a lot of laboratory testing, and some of his earlier publications, very well-known publications, started on the strength of clays, working on clays, and he had worked, I think, on piles with Lyman Reese, if my memory serves me right, and then did, of course, a lot of work with Ken Lee, extremely using high quality testing to develop, I think, what we came to know as the cyclic triaxial test. I think that was basically a development that Harry and Ken, together with Clarence Chan at UC Berkeley, did back in the 60s, early 60s. And then some of these case histories evolved, and the need to develop methods of analysis came about, and so he began to work on that. And so he told us that his research moved into the analysis field, and then after that, after working very intently into analysis, he moved into the analysis and evaluation of case histories. And in the end, you know, I remember he had a paragraph on the wall of his office from an English author of the 1200s or something like that, saying something to the effect that, you know, we can learn a lot from reasoning, you know, that reasoning, but that in fact, true knowledge and the confidence in knowledge only comes from experience, you know. And he gave each one of us in his class, it wasn't framed, but it, you know, a 11 by, you know, 8.5 by 11 a piece of paper with this in quotes, and as something he said, always remember this, you know. And he had evolved into the analysis of case histories because he said, you know, that's ultimately what that experience is, what really teaches us. But, you know, the sense I have is he valued and he deemed to be probably equally important all of those aspects of our profession, the investigations and material characterization, understanding of material behavior, the analysis aspects, and of course, putting all of that in perspective through our experience-based knowledge.
Yeah. That's great. That's great. Thank you again very much, Lelio, for joining us today and for these great stories. Last but not least, we have Dr. Les Harder with us. We all know, of course, of work and collaborations with Professor Harry Seed, but hopefully we're going to get to hear some more stories as well. Thank you, Les, for joining us today.
Well, Adda, thank you. And it's really a pleasure to be on this program, especially with my three colleagues here. So thank you for the invitation. When I was working with Professor Seed, I was a student. Later in his career, he had already been fairly well developed, and he already established as a giant in geotechnical engineering and geotechnical earthquake engineering. I think I was his 48th out of 50 PhD students. But he was an amazing engineer. We've already heard about that. He's pretty much a problem solver, teacher, but he could be tough and demanding, but full of humor, kindness, and grace all the way through that. So he had a special relationship with the California Department of Water Resources, or DWR. DWR had funded a lot of his early research, a lot of the cyclic testing that was just referenced by Lelio. That was originally funded by DWR. Early shake table tests, there was one for Orville in the early 1960s. DWR funded that, of course. Funded the studies of Sheffield Dam, helped fund Faiz in his work on Lower San Fernando. And in fact, DWR did the drilling for the Lower San Fernando and did most of the laboratory tests. So this was in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that this relationship was going on. And I joined DWR in the late 70s. And a lot of people I worked with in DWR had interactions with Professor Seed over time. They all spoke glowingly of him, how wonderful a guy he was, what a terrific teacher, and how he fixed all these problems for people. One of the things I observed Professor Seed over time, and by the way, I too only called him Professor Seed. He solved people and organizational problems, just not technical problems on a particular project. I mean, sometimes there were people problems or organizational issues and difficulties that were actually more significant than the technical issues at hand. And he often found ways that, you know, basically could address people's concerns, have a path forward that, you know, basically not only solved the technical issues, but made all the different parties more or less happy. And that's a considerable achievement for many of those situations. He could be tough at times. I remember in the early 1980s, I had just started at Berkeley. I was walking down the hall in Davis Hall with him, and a young student came up to him he was a bit upset. And the student had not done very well on an exam, and he was upset about it. And it wasn't so much he was trying to change his grade, but just trying to understand why he did so poorly on it. And Professor Seed just nodded at him and said to come see him in office hours, and left him with a statement that exams are learning opportunities. Okay, so we walked off. The student was still upset, but he had something to think about. I had something to think about too. I was thinking, this is going to be a lot tougher than I thought it was going to be. So that's the way I learned that particular statement. But Professor Seed was beloved as a teacher. He made things understandable by practicing engineers. And he gave them tools that could be used. Very few people were doing that at that time, and there's still only a few people who are still doing that. So, but he was beloved, whether he was teaching in a classroom or giving a talk at a conference or working on a project or on a consulting board. You know, he just was a great teacher. He smiled a lot. Whether in meetings or in classes, he would smile and he would laugh a lot. And one of the things he would do when he'd laugh, he would tilt his head to the sky and just laugh. He did that mannerism. I just remember so much. He liked to give friendly teases and pokes at people, always with a smile. And I remember there was a big conference lecture in San Francisco hosted by ASCE San Francisco in the mid-'80s. And it was going to be Professor Seed giving his point of view on liquefaction and another gentleman giving a different point of view on liquefaction. The seminar was well attended. 200 or 300 people were there. There was a group of us from DWR who had driven from Sacramento to go see this thing. It took 2.5 hours to get there, and we saw this. And the two gentlemen, Professor Seed and the other person, gave their points of view. But at one point, Professor Seed walked over to the podium of the other guy, put his hand on his shoulder and said, you know, you're just a fabulous fellow. You're just terrific. And I wouldn't argue with you so much except for the fact that you're wrong all the time. So that, of course, brought down the house. 200 or 300 people are laughing uproariously. The other guy's laughing. It was amazing. Driving home that night with my colleagues from DWR, we agreed that only Professor Seed could say that and get away with it that way. But I saw him give those kinds of friendly pokes at various people, and I was a victim of that too. I think Faiz made a reference to the red pen. So when I was turning in my dissertation, I would do a chapter at a time. This is the summer of 1988, and I would give him one of my chapters, and it'd be about 40 pages long, and he'd return it to me marked up. I mean, Faiz, I think when you said he was a good editor, on my stuff, he bled all over it, and I was convinced the university bought him red pens by the truckload because every single page looked like, it was red, and I was disappointed because I thought I was a fairly good writer, at least better than the average graduate student, because I was an older student and I was in my mid-30s and I had been writing engineering reports for 10 years. But I humbly took back my chapter and worked on it for a week, and I brought it back, a revised version for him to review, and he reviewed it and gave it back to me. Just as much red as last time, and it was bloody. And I was disappointed, and I'm looking at it in his office with him, and as Professor Seed, I corrected all the edits and points you made in my first review, and these seem to be new edits and for things that were there in the first draft, but you didn't comment on in the first review. And he smiles at me and gives me this little poke and says, "Yeah, well, it was so badly written that I couldn't read it all clearly." Okay. Well, that smile, that little jab, took it back and redid it. And all my chapters that summer went that way. So anyway,
it looks like I was a better writer than you. I'm just kidding.
No doubt, as you've told me since too. Both you and Lelio have corrected me on my writing many times. But I learned a lot about writing in the summer of '88. he was kind, and you guys have already made references to that, that kindness. It was pervasive. I'll just give you a couple examples. In the summer of '88, while I'm at home rewriting red marked up drafts, I get a call from Professor Seed. He says, I need some of your slides on the Becker penetration test. I'm going to give a talk. I said, okay. When do you need them? Right now. Oh, okay. Well, you know, I lived in the Sacramento area, which is a 2-hour drive from Berkeley. So I said, it's going to take me 2 hours to get there. And I'm watching my daughter today. My daughter Adrian was 3.5 at the time. And so she's going to have to come too. He said, all right, and she can sit in my office. All right. So I pack up everything, slide carousel, slide projector, my daughter, we drive to Berkeley, go to his office. I park my daughter in a chair, give her a toy, be quiet. Shh, you gotta be quiet. He's a great man. Okay. And I set up the projector and I show slides on the wall of his office. And he would look through them and he'd go, no, no, no. Yes, I'll take that one. Yes, that one. And finally, a slide came up that I had prepared to show the various sizes of the and different types of Becker penetration drill bits and drive bits, along with the standard penetration test. And for scale, I had used my daughter, who was 3.5, and she was in this photo prominently. The same daughter was sitting in her chair. So she looks up from her toy and sees herself, smiles, and Professor Seed says no and passes on, and she screams, no! And she, and I had never seen him so flustered or flabbergasted. He dropped all the slides in his hands, but then he calmly pressed the reverse button and her image came back on the wall, and he spoke to her and said, is this the one? You like this one? And she goes, yes, 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 use that, yes. He said, okay, we'll use it. He picked it out of the tray, and she calmed down and she went back to her toy. But he was pretty kind to her with that outburst. If I had known my daughter had this power of Professor Seed, I could have used that earlier in my career with him, but I did not. So anyway, other things, there was a point where, because I had dropped down to part-time to pursue my doctoral degree, and my wife had dropped down part-time to help take care of Adrian. We were struggling a little bit financially. He arranged to get me a paid research assistant position. Another time there was a big consulting board meeting in Sacramento on a dam or something. And so the consulting board, and just the consulting board, went out to dinner that night. But he arranged for me to go to, this young engineer, so I got to sit with the board, and I got to sit next to Ralph Peck that night, and Professor Seed arranged that for me to do that. And that night was magical, and I always appreciate and remember it. When my second child, Thomas, was born, Professor Seed and his wife sent us baby gifts, including baby clothes, and we were really touched by that. So I best remember him not so much for his greatness, but as just an extraordinary teacher, for his humor and for his kindness. I've missed him a lot. He's very much missed. He did affect my career, as Faiz and Lelio spoke. And one last thing, he was very proud of his son, Ray. So thank you.
Thank you, Les, very much. Great stories. I think it's really no accident that this has been the common thread between all the stories we've heard from all four of you. And I think this is precisely, why we wanted to have this discussion. I think it's, it makes sense that, people like me who have never interacted with him personally, you know him from his work, from his publications, from what you hear. But I think it's really important to realize that he was a person, right? Behind this name, behind the publication, he was a person, and he was a great person, given all your stories. And I think this is really important. And something actually, Les, that you mentioned that I think, deserves further highlighting is what you mentioned about not only solving the engineering problems, but also realizing that a lot of what we do has to do with people, right? And making sure that people, feel welcome or feel heard, or agencies learn how to work together, which is something, right, that we keep talking about to students to this day. So I think this is really interesting to highlight. I had never heard that specifically being said about Professor Harry Seed, so I found that really interesting. I was kind of curious, and maybe, we can start from Les, but maybe all of you can kind of quickly touch on that, especially with someone who we all think of as a brilliant mind, someone who essentially started an entire field. What was he like when he would sit down to approach a new problem? Like, what was that process like? What was he like when he would sit down, to kind of think something through? And perhaps it was in his office, or perhaps, a case study, walking in the field, observing. What were his go-to things, for new problems?
Well, if you're asking me to start this off, I'll give just a couple of thoughts. One is that what initially comes to my mind is that he wanted to focus on the end in mind. What's the end state? What is either the final answer or the final product going to look like in one form? It's not that he had a predetermined answer. It was that we're here to accomplish something on this project, and what is that? And so I think he focused on that first, and then from that, so what do we need to do to get there? And outline whether it was a laboratory program or a field program or a literature research or all of the above. And then who best to accomplish this? One thing I'll just throw in, he knew everybody too, anybody with any kind of connection. And so in my research on the Becker penetration test, I wanted to get some test sites where I can compare the Becker and the SPT, and I was using some sites where there was already SPT done, so I just had to do the Becker. And one of these sites was on North Island Naval Air Station by San Diego, and which is a hydraulic fill, and I wanted to test there, but I had no idea how to get that done. It's classified area, secret, and military personnel only, and that's where they tie up nuclear carriers and so on. And he said, "Oh, not to worry. I had lunch with the admiral last week. I'll call him." So he knew everybody.
Wow! Anybody else want to jump in on this?
In my view, I think his approach to promoting the state of practice and state of art it's incremental. He was a master on getting graduate students to deal with different aspects of the problem, giving them an assignment and a time limit, and then improve the knowledge and understanding by these incremental processes and contributions of different graduate students attending to solving different problems. In my case, I'm just this kind of an anecdote. I wasn't very comfortable with the idea of working on a simplified procedure, and that's a different story because I didn't think this was original work for a PhD program. So at the end, I said, well, I'm finished. He said, you're done. You've done what I asked you to do, and you should finish. I said, I'd like to take another 3 or 4 months and do another chapter. He said, I'll give you 3 more months, and afterwards you're gone. And I spent another 3 more months, added another chapter, but that's how he operated. He gives you an assignment, you do it, and he adds to the knowledge.
I remember him as a very good listener, actually, and sitting in meetings with him while people presented to him, and being able to distill the essence of a problem quite quickly, actually, and so zeroing in, like Les mentioned, on how to solve the problem, what with the end in mind, and in doing that, in his consulting with, I remember, doing it with some of his clients when I was helping him as a research assistant. But also after I graduated and I started to work here in San Francisco, our firm retained him for a few consulting projects, and he always, impressed my bosses, and everyone by being able to just quickly go to after looking at all the facts and so on, being able to distill, okay, what is the main issue here? The key issue is this, and how do we solve it? And these are the possible ways to get to the issue. And he was actually a master at doing that.
Ray, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think one of his other secrets was he had an amazing bandwidth, but also an ability to peer through all that he was absorbing and see what was going to matter in the end. He would read all the papers, he'd go to all the conferences, he'd sit in small sessions, not just the big plenary sessions. He'd be talking in the hallway, he'd be talking at the breaks, he'd be meeting everybody, and he was organizing the material, he was organizing who had done the work and how he felt about that as well. And then something would come up, and each of the other speakers have brought up a situation like that, and he'd remember this, he'd remember that, and he'd begin piecing it together. And then he'd look through the middle of it all and say, and this is what we're going to do. And sometimes it wasn't the answer. This is just how we're going to find the answer. And sometimes it was just the answer. But his ability to deal with enormous amounts of data in a time before there were computers to help you do that, and to remember all the people and all the people involved in creating those data and all of their views and their positions, and then sort through to the middle and develop what was going to be an acceptable solution was remarkable.
That's great. That's great. We did get a couple of questions that I wanted to bring up because I think it may be actually a nice way to kind of head towards wrapping our session up since we are at the hour. But John Stewart and then a follow-up by Ben Mason, basically along the theme of, are there video, audio recordings or correspondence by Professor Seed? And if so, I'm kind of adding that part on my own. What do we think would be a great way to kind of bring this all together? Maybe this could be a joint effort by GI and USUCGER. I'm sure a lot of members would love to have access to, curated material like that. But I don't know, do the four of you know whether there is something like this available somewhere and whether that we could use as a start?
I don't, but I don't know. I suspect that Ray would be the best person to address that, I would think.
There's not going to be a lot of material. He didn't want to leave a lot of stuff behind, and so he didn't. He cleaned his stuff out and filed some of it, sent some of it to people for whom it might be pertinent in his view, and kind of cleaned house. He'd made an agreement with his wife, my mother, that he would finish when he was done, and he was going to be done when he was 65. He ran past that a little bit, but he tried very hard to get there, and he didn't want to be memorialized. He wasn't much into that stuff. Arthur Casagrande left an enormous trove of stuff at the Waterways Experiment Station, and he had bad memories of walking through there and looking at it and think, wow, we could do better with the office. And so it wasn't his style. He was more efficient. So there's probably not much that's retrievable that wasn't also publishable. And that was in the end part of his process. As several people have mentioned, he would look at something and he would see what the end was going to be. And for him, the end was often a report or a paper, and then he was done because he'd remember the rest of it.
Yeah,
I'll have to check, but I may have kept the original manuscript of my thesis in with his markings. Opposite to Les's experience, they were actually in pencil, and there were plenty of them, but not. Doesn't sound like it was as bad as you had to go through, Les. If I have that, I would be happy to share that if I can find it.
The other thing, I think he passed away too early, so that at times, in conferences used to be recorded, but these were early days where you didn't have the technology to record presentations and lectures and so on. So that's, I think, is a loss.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Well, we are at time. I would like to take a moment here to thank you all for joining us today, for sharing all these wonderful stories. I'm sure everybody who listened in and everybody who will listen in at the recording on YouTube is going to really enjoy kind of getting to know a little bit more of Professor Harry Seed, who has really left huge mark on our discipline, but on a lot of people, which I think is perhaps even more important. So with that, I don't know if Brad has any final words before we bring this meeting to an end. I'm sure he's going to put a plug in to subscribe on the YouTube channel and all that. So Brad, again, thanks for doing this with USUCGER, and I'm going to pass it back to you.
Thanks, Adda, and great job to all of our panelists. And I don't have a lot to add, except this was phenomenal. And I think, especially for a lot of our younger members and younger people in the community, they may go to Geo-Congress every year. They may hear the award lectures. They see the medal up at the front. And that's their connection to somebody like Professor Seed. I think something like today really goes a long way toward humanizing, the legends of our field for these people. And so it was really important that everybody share the stories the way you guys did today, and we're really appreciative of it. Now, I know everyone out there is saying there were audio difficulties, and Lelio, you're the one that got hit with this. We had some technical issues during your presentation. So I might have to have another talk with you and have you do it again, and maybe we'll make that a bonus episode of something here in the future. But we were able to get that resolved, and everything else for the rest of the way was okay. So thanks for sticking with us, everybody. As Adda said, yes, you absolutely should subscribe to the GI YouTube channel. Again, we'll let you know every time that we post something new when you do that. Our next live stream will be a week from today in Austin at the Offshore Geotechnics Conference that we're running. Look for information about that on our Eventbrite and on the ISFOG website as well. We would love to have you along for that one. So thanks again to all our panelists today, and to Adda for moderating, and for USUCGER to partnering with us for this great event. And we will see everybody next time.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Like looking at a magazine. You hurt on the floor, feels like dancing is the way to go. But if you let her see that man say footwork, sure that you're not that shy. Let her see that man say footwork, sure you're that type of guy. Young boy, don't be late. This girl ain't really got time to wait. You think it's all for show, but this is just the only way I know. But if you let her see that man say footwork,